Welcome to In His Grip with Dr. Chuck F. Betters of markinc.org. Visit markinc.org, where you'll discover many free resources, videos, devotionals, and more that will equip you to walk by faith and offer help and hope. You can also find out about our online biblical counseling service. That's markinc.org.
In Judges chapter 6, 7, and 8, we have introduced to you the story of Gideon. If you remember, I entitled this series, Conversion from Fear to Faith. Specifically, last week we looked at, do you want to be like Gideon? And the answer to that is categorically no. You don't want to be like Gideon. Gideon is a helpless, paralyzed, fearful man who found himself in a spiritual vacuum, impotent to do anything except thresh and hiding on the threshing floor. If you miss in Judges 6 through 8 the central message, which is that by the grace of God we are what we are and we become what we become, if you miss the essential dimension of the cross of Jesus Christ as the focal point of who we are, then you've missed the message of Judges. Judges is a book of cycles. The people slip into apostasy. God raises up by His grace a deliverer. The people are delivered and then fall right back into that apostasy. In fact, when the book of Judges ends, it says that every man did what was right in his own eyes. There was no leader. And yet the stage is set as the book of Judges falls between two great epics of redemptive history. On the one hand, you have the Exodus and the covenant that God formed through Abraham and Moses and Joshua, bringing the people out of bondage. And then on the other hand, you have the formation of the Davidic dynasty, through which, through the kingly line, Jesus himself would come to confirm and to ratify once and for all that covenant. The book of Judges falls in between. It's a book of God's grace. It's a book that demonstrates to us God's mercy. And the only way in which we ought to be like Gideon is when we rely humbly upon the grace and the mercy of God. It is only in that context that we ought to desire to be like this man. In fact, as you read the end of the story, if you jump ahead to Judges chapter 8, you will see that when the victory is consummated, when the Midianites are defeated, when the two kings are killed, and when the conquering Gideon and his army amass this great victory, one very insignificant or seemingly insignificant verse talks about how Gideon took some gold from that king. That gold becomes an ephod or an idol, and Israel is led right back into idolatry by worshiping that idol. So what ought to have been a source of great victory becomes a source of idolatry, and the people of God fall right back into apostasy. So I don't want to be like Gideon, even though he's in the Hall of Fame in Hebrews 11. In fact, I want to make one categorical statement. I don't want to be like anybody in Hebrews 11, do you? When you read that great list of spiritual giants, as we call them in Hebrews 11, as you read about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and Deborah and Barak, and you read about Gideon and all the others who are in Hebrews chapter 11, what one thing keeps coming out of the pages of Hebrews 11? These were men who were sinners. These were men who were sinful losers before they were invaded by the power of God. The whole purpose of Hebrews 11 is to point us in faith toward Jesus Christ. It is because of Christ's work in their lives, it is because of God's grace in their lives that these men have any recognition in human history whatsoever. And likewise it is with you and me. Apart from Christ, the Scriptures tell us, we can do nothing. Now, what does nothing mean? You know what the Greek word for nothing is? Nothing. Apart from Christ, we can do what? Nothing. We are nothing. We can do nothing apart from Christ. It is by His grace that we even sit here today. That's the story of Judges 6 through 8. Last time we were together, we talked about God's scorch marks in your life. You remember I cautioned each of us that we will receive that phone call. Each of us will be invaded by some form of suffering before you die. And it'll be scary. In fact, it can even be paralyzing. It can move you to the point where you can't even open your mouth. It's like a ride we went on, a water ride down in Florida. It's at a water park in Florida. It just goes straight down. It's a big high slide and goes straight down. When you sit down at the top, you can't even see the bottom. Now, my wife is a screamer when it comes to these rides. You get her on a roller coaster or something, and it's funnier just being with her than it is riding the ride, just watching and listening to her scream. But on that particular one, you can't even scream, because when you start down, you open your mouth, you go, and nothing comes out, because it's straight down. It's paralyzing fear. And that's kind of where we are, I think, sometimes when we receive that phone call. Now, I don't literally mean a phone call. Some of you may never lose a child. I hope and pray that you wouldn't. I wouldn't wish that kind of experience on my worst enemy. And I would encourage you to not misunderstand what I'm saying here. I am not saying for 1 minute that any of you are going to experience that kind of tragedy. However, all of us will experience some form of paralyzing suffering. And it is at that point that we find Gideon, where he is threshing on the threshing floor, in hiding from the Amalekites and the Midianites and the children from the east, who would lie in wait until Israel produced the food, and then they would invade them and take their food and leave Israel in virtual poverty. For 7 years this went on. And when we find Gideon, he's there with his tail tucked between his legs, suffering from this kind of oppression. And it is at that point, at that juncture of paralyzing fear, that the Spirit of God appears to him, that the angel of the Lord comes to him and begins to converse and calls him a mighty warrior. You see, from the perspective of man, Gideon looked anything but like a mighty warrior. But from the perspective of God's transforming grace, he sees beyond where we are. He sees beyond who we are. And he looks into my heart and sees the lordship of Jesus Christ. And it is through that transforming grace that he can say to me, you are a mighty warrior, not because of you, but because of my strength in you. So Gideon prepares a sacrifice as a test. Because you see, this angel, which I believe is a theophany, that is Christ himself, that is a pre-incarnational appearance of Christ himself, Christ appears to him and tells him that through his strength, that is the strength that he would find in Christ, Israel would be delivered. And Gideon says, well, we better check this out and make sure this is really the Lord talking to me and not some demonic power. So he goes out and he prepares this enormous sacrifice. Now Gideon knew in his mind that when he brought that sacrifice back, that the angel, which is Christ, had two options. He would either eat the sacrifice or do something miraculous. If he ate the sacrifice, he would know that was not the angel of the Lord. Because you see, the angel of the Lord does not eat sacrifices. He does not need material sustenance. And so when the angel of the Lord touches that sacrifice with his rod, and it is fiery, and the fire consumes that sacrifice, Gideon steps back and says, something strange has happened here. I have seen God face to face. I'm a dead man. And so the proof was there. Well, he still wasn't convinced. So he asked for more proof. And you know the story of the fleece, and I don't want to get into whether or not he was right or wrong in asking for the fleece. I believe he was wrong. That should solve it for you, right? So he asked for it two ways. You know, once with the dew on the fleece and once with the dew on the floor, just to make sure this truly was God speaking to him. But I believe the principle is not the fleece. The principle is not in the seeking of the sign. The principle is in divine condescension. It is God condescending to man. That's the whole beauty of the cross. God condescending to man. He touches the fleece one way one night and one way the next day and proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that this truly is coming from the Lord. Well, having said all of that, all of these dealings, by the way, are in private with Gideon. You see, God has to deal first in private with us. But I want you to note something as we continue our study of this pericope, of these 3 chapters. I want you to note something. What God does in private, He demands out of Gideon in public. No one is ever saved privately. You say, what do you mean? I mean, God never saves and delivers us so that we can, quote, keep our religion private between ourselves and God. Christianity is not a private religion. Christianity is a public demonstration of the Spirit of God. You see, when Pentecost happened, it happened publicly. When Jesus died, He died publicly. When He rose from the dead, He rose publicly, and He verified His power with many witnesses. And by the way, when He comes again, He will come publicly. Every eye will see Him. Every knee will bow. Every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. Hope you believe that today. Because we know from Matthew chapter 24 that one of the signs of the coming of Christ is the increase of activity and of certain signs, and one of them is earthquakes. When you stop to think about what has taken place in this century, in the past, since 1900 to the present, in the past 94 years, how many earthquakes, how many people have died? When we see and hear the rumblings of the earth, the scourge of AIDS, the disease and pestilence, the famines worldwide, the earthquakes, the changing in climatic conditions, and all of that, the earth is pulsating. It is, in fact, I heard one fellow say, one reporter on CNN this past week, he said it was like the earth was moaning and groaning. Those were the words he used. You see, those are biblical words. That's what the Bible says. The earth will moan and groan as a woman in labor about to give birth. What are we talking about here? But you see, God is not in the earthquake. God is not in the wind. He's in the still small voice. And He speaks to us in a private way, seeking to convert us from paralyzing fear to genuine faith. And in our lives, He will leave some scorch marks that testify to God's invasion in our lives. And our lives, as impotent as they are, viewed from the perspective of God's power and grace, inevitably what happens in private will have to be demonstrated in public. And that brings us to verse 25 of Judges chapter 6. Let's look at that. Judges 6, beginning with verse 25. So Gideon, verse 24, built the altar, called it the Lord is peace. To this day it stands. Now verse 25. That same night the Lord said to him, take the second bull from your father's herd, the one that's 7 years old. Tear down your father's altar to Baal, and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on the top of this bluff. Using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down, offer the second bull as a burnt offering. So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he was afraid of his family, anybody here qualify? How many of you sitting here right now, you're the only Christian in your family? You're the only believer. You're laughed at, you're scorned, and you're ridiculed. You're mocked, you're told you're in a cult. People think you're crazy. You give what to the church? 10%? Are you nuts? We've had accountants sit down with people who are Christians, who tithe. They pull their hair out. So what are you doing? How can you possibly do something like that? Christians are crazy. You know, we're crazy. We are a crazy, loony people, aren't we? We do some strange things. Why, we come and we talk to the space, it seems. We sing to the space. We act like God is right here. We actually believe that God is right here in this place. Isn't that foolish? That's how some of your family members think. Gideon was afraid of his family. He was afraid of his family, verse 27, and the men of the town. So he did it at night rather than in the daytime. Wonderful warrior. In the morning, when the men of the town got up, there was Baal's altar demolished, with the Asherah pole beside it, cut down, and the second bull sacrificed on the newly built altar. They asked, who did this? When they carefully investigated, they were told, Gideon, son of Joash. He did it. The men of the town demanded of Joash, bring your son out. He must die because he's broken down Baal's altar and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. But Joash replied to the hostile crowd around him, are you going to plead Baal's cause? Are you trying to save him? Whoever fights for him shall be put to death by morning. If Baal really is God, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar. So that day they called Gideon Jerubbaal, saying, let Baal contend, because you see, that's what Jerubbaal means. Let Baal contend because he broke down Baal's altar. You see what God is doing here now? He has worked a private work between him and Gideon alone. He has effected his grace in Gideon's life, and now he is moving him out into the public sphere. God never saves us privately to keep us private. God saves us privately in order that we might invade the kingdom of hell. So Gideon is being prepared for a public ministry, and the first place he needs to start is in his own family. That's the first place God sends him. It's not enough to accept God's private call. Private commitment must produce public discipleship. God had begun a healing process in Gideon with an encounter with Jesus Christ. And you see, there's a dynamic that's triggered here which moves him outward to affect the world in which he lived. Likewise, God is seeking to move you outward into the world in which you live. I remember Haddon Robinson, a homiletics professor, wrote a book actually wrote an article in Christianity Today some time ago, where he talked about the trends in our culture. And he said, we have more religion in America today than we've ever had before. There is more religion. We have church-related schools. We've had presidents who have stood up and used the term born again freely. 37 million Americans buy Christian books. We have celebrities all the time who are speaking out for Christ, including athletes. We have national religious leaders who are on the covers of national magazines. 60 million people claim to be born again. Evangelical seminaries are raising up 40% of church leaders. And on the list goes. Yet on the downside, American society seems to be unaffected by Christian values. You see, it's technology and not the church that has emerged as the dominating force in our culture. 98% of Americans have at least one TV, cable, dishes, feed the addiction. Each week we watch incest and rape and divorce and violence. Never in any of those cases is the minister ever called. And when he is called, he's short, bald-headed, and effeminate. No one ever goes to church on TV. The magic word seems to be that God is irrelevant, that the church is irrelevant. The talk show assumptions are what? Do what is right in your own eyes. Feed your own pleasure. If it feels good, you go ahead and do it. Absolutes are absolutely not allowed. While the Christian moralists are tolerated. In fact, probably more so viewed as bigots than anything else. You don't hear about chastity as a solution to AIDS. It's dismissed as prudency. Adultery is considered therapeutic for the midlife crisis. Madison Avenue resorts to music and pictures to transform covetousness into virtue and persuades us that we deserve everything we get, from our hamburgers to our automobiles. When TV bores you, hit the VCR. Go to the rental place, where most frequently the X's and the R's are what are passed out. Christians have been bookish and rational and ordered and individualistic, but now we are being bewildered in a communications revolution, and we don't know what to do with it. Technology has created a global village in which the East and the West not only meet, but they marry. Eastern mysticism and occult philosophies have infiltrated modern medicine, have infiltrated the arts and psychology and religion. And as a result of that, Americans are conditioned to accept a worldview that implicitly rejects the personal God of Scripture. It asserts the autonomy and the individuality and the diversity of human beings and rejects absolute norms in ethics. This is the culture you are supposed to engage. This is the dynamic of life in America. You see, there are two very imminent dangers I see. We can either deliver the pure milk of the Word in contaminated bottles or not deliver the milk at all. You have been given something unique in Jesus Christ. He has scorched your life indelibly. He has invaded your soul. And if you have any love at all for the nation in which you live, you will engage your culture with that gospel. There will be no revival until God's people go public with what they believe. And notice the starting point. For Gideon, it was his own backyard. The first person he had to confront was his dad, his own family. You see, Joash's Asherah pole served as a village shrine. Joash was the pastor of the first church of Baal. And everybody came and congregated and worshiped at the shrine that was in his backyard. But God's will was clear. Gideon, until you put things right in your own backyard, I will not effect any deliverance. There will be no deliverance. There will be no revival. There will be no turning back of this nation until God's people clean up their own backyard and take what God has done privately and take it out publicly and engage the world in which you live. But we're too cowardly. You know why we're cowardly? Because we think it all depends on us. Once again, we're missing the grace of God. What does he tell us? Don't worry about what you'll say. Don't worry in that moment of what to say. I'll give you the words. I'll tell you what to say. I'll make you strong. Don't go in your strength. Go in my strength. I will go before you. I will cut the path. He was to take two bulls, one young, one 7 years old, which belonged to his dad, and he was to use them to tear down the altar of Baal that his dad had built. He was then to cut down the pole and use it as wood to burn the second bull in a sacrifice to the God on the altar, and then that was to become a symbol of which God was more powerful. The Asherah pole was most offensive to God. In a few hours, Gideon and 10 servants destroyed the altar. 26 feet wide, 4.5 feet high, cut down the pole. They built a new altar to God. They prepared and sacrificed a bullock to God. You see, friends, before God can invade the world with his people, we have got to tear down the idols that exist in our own backyards. I am not at all tempted, I don't think. And maybe I'm wrong, but as I think about it, I am not at all tempted with things that are evil. It is not the evil things that tempt me. It's the good things that tempt me. It's the things that God has provided that he says are good that I tend to make shrines out of. I don't have any problems worshiping in a satanic church. I don't do it. I just don't do it. I don't have a drug problem. I don't have an alcohol problem. I don't frequent prostitutes. I don't have a problem with any of that. It's the good things that God has provided for me that become idols and shrines that until I tear them down by the power of God's grace, I will never be able to engage the world in which I live. There's no victory as long as we have divided hearts. All of the Asherah poles in my backyard signal my allegiance to the icons of materialism and humanism and self-centeredness, and one by one they must be chopped down for God to deal with the Midianites who oppress me. You see, God's altar cannot be built until Baal's altar is destroyed. No worship is acceptable to God until we relieve ourselves of the false altars in our lives. And the place to start is your own family. The place to start is in your own backyard. You know, it saddens me, especially since we've experienced what we've experienced. And I thank God that we don't have any torturous memories. We can honestly stand before you today and say we have no regrets in how we raised our son. None at all. He did not die wondering whether or not he was loved. He did not die never hearing that he was loved. He did not die without hugs and kisses from his dad and his mom. He did not die with bitterness and conflict in his family. He died a loved child, and I have no regrets, none at all in that context. But you know what greatly disturbs me is to see how we treat our families, how we treat them, how we fail to take every day as a blessing that comes from God. Every day, you men, you fathers who are sitting here, every day God has called on you to tear down the Baal altars in your backyard, to work descriptively with your children, definitively with your children to identify those altars, to interface with your children. And when they spend more time watching TV in one day than they spend communicating with you in a lifetime, something's wrong. Something's wrong. The night Mark was killed, I had my arm around him as he walked out the door, pulling his hair and telling him how much I loved him and kissing him. We take our children for granted. We fail to see that there are altars that are subtle altars, good altars. Remember the story in Scripture about the snakes, the serpents that God had sent to murmuring and complaining Israel? In fact, they're even referenced by Jesus in the Gospel of John. He says, as the serpent was lifted up in the wilderness, that whosoever looked upon the serpent that God had raised up would live, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Remember that story? Wonderful story. You ever wonder what happened to that serpent? You ever wonder what happened to that brazen pole that had been erected in the wilderness, and in faith as they looked to it, symbolic of looking in faith to Christ, the people were healed? You read later on in the book of Kings that same bronze pole had been constructed or reconstructed into an icon. They even had a name for it, Nehushtan. And they worshiped that brazen snake, that bronze idol. The word Nehushtan means bronze serpent. And so what was good and what was pleasing in the sight of God, what was a means of God's deliverance, became an idol. You see, it's not the evil things that tempt us, it's the good things that tempt us. And slowly but surely we erect them in our backyards. Your children are valuable, friends. You better cherish every moment, especially when one of these letters come, especially when that phone call takes place. Those children are valuable because they are the heritage of the Lord. I'll close with this. I came across something some time ago. Don't know where I got it from, but it's called Laughter in the Walls. When you go home today, I want you to look around your house. And I want you to ask yourself this question. If we cut down all the Asherah poles in this home, are my children walking with the Lord? Have I invested the energy? Because you see, until that home is set in order, the power of a public witness cannot be achieved. God's next step after the conversion of Joash was to take Gideon public, to face the culture in which he lived. But I came across something. It speaks for itself. It's called Laughter in the Walls, written by a man named Bob Benson. He says, I pass a lot of houses on my way home. Some pretty, some expensive, some inviting, but my heart always skips a beat when I turn down the road and see my house nestled against the hill. I guess I'm especially proud of the house and the way it looks because I drew the plans myself. It started out large enough for us. I even had a study. 2 teenaged boys now reside in there. And it had a guest room. My girl and 9 dolls are permanent guests. A small room Peg had hoped would be her sewing room. 2 boys swinging on the Dutch door have claimed this room as their own. So it really doesn't look right now as if I'm much of an architect. But it will get larger again. One by one, they will go away to work, to college, to service, to their own houses. And then there will be room for just the 2 of us. But it won't be empty. Every corner, every room, every nick in the coffee table will be crowded with memories. Memories of picnics, parties, Christmases, bedside vigils, summers, fires, winters, going barefoot, leaving for vacation, cats, conversations, black eyes, graduations, first dates, ball games, arguments, washing dishes, bicycles, dogs, boat rides, getting home from vacation, meals, rabbits, and 1,000 other things that fill our lives of those who would raise 5. And Peg and I will sit quietly by the fire and listen to the laughter in the walls. Father, forgive us for our failures in our own homes. Forgive us for allowing the Asherah poles to be built, for the icons to be made out of good things. Forgive us for failing to see our children for who they are and for what they are, wonderful gifts that have come from you. Father, we desire more than anything else to be relevant to the world in which we live. And just as you have converted Gideon by leaving an indelible scorch mark in his life, so you also called him to be a public witness in a corporate context. But the means by which that happened first was through his own family. So likewise, Father, in our homes, there is much work to be done. And we know we're insufficient to do it ourselves. We can't. We're too weak. The crush and the oppression is too great. The complexity is too overwhelming. And that is why we need your grace. Oh, God, help us never to take for granted what you've entrusted to our care, beginning with those wonderful children that are gifts from you.
You've been listening to Dr. Chuck F. Betters in this program brought to you by MarkInc.org, proclaiming the truth that God is sovereign and you can trust him. Please visit us online at MarkInc.org to learn about other free resources, such as our Help and Hope personal stories addressing a variety of topics and difficult circumstances. Hear answers to tough questions about suffering and the sovereignty of God in our Ask Dr. Betters video series. receive encouraging devotionals from Daily Treasure, and more. Looking for help? We now offer online biblical counseling service through Anchored Hope Biblical Counseling, an online platform that will bring solid biblical counseling to those in need wherever and whenever they need it. Visit biblicalcounseling.online to make an appointment today.